No One Likes Us Clothing is the clothing range designed by Millwall fans for Millwall fans. Caps, t-shirts, polos, they've got it all. Visit noonelikesus.co.uk for the full range. Or if you're in Bermondsey on a match day, why not have a pint in the Blue Anchor pub and pick up a Nolu polo shirt, Nolu clothing at www.noonelikesus.co.uk.
It's Nick and Neil's Summer Millwall History Show.
Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to Nick and Neil's Summertime History Show. Big welcome to Neil Fischler. Thanks for coming on the show, Neil.
Hello, Nick. How you going, mate? How you going?
Yeah, good, mate. Good. Both of our eyes were caught by this name that appeared on Twitter the other day. It was to do with the anniversary, the July the 1st anniversary of the Battle of the Somme. In one of the most horrendous battles in the First World War, huge casualties on all sides, including the British side, British and Commonwealth side. And the name of George King popped up now, didn't it? A Scottish footballer. And I must admit, I hadn't seen his name. I hadn't realised that he'd played for the Millwall Athletic prior to the start of the First World War, as well as Burnley and Sunderland. And we thought it might be a nice idea just to mark obviously the battle itself, but also George King's name, because I don't think he's named on the official war memorial. There's the club have a bronze plaque, and I don't think it's one of the names on there. I could be wrong, so correct me if I'm wrong, listeners, but I haven't seen his name previously, and it just really stuck out at me. He was actually killed on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, George King.
Yeah, what happened was I've been updating my Millwall Who's Who book, and we've added 30 or 40 amateur players from right at the start of Millwall's history. And I think I've stumbled across a potential player that died in World War One. So I went onto Twitter and I spoke to a guy called Jeff Williamson, I think he's called, who's a World War One football historian.
Yeah.
And asked him about this guy. There's a little bit more work to do to actually prove that he was the Millwall player.
Right.
Then a couple of days later, he tagged me in on July the 1st, I think it was, on George King, who was a player that I was aware of.
Okay.
Because of mainly because of his controversial nature of his transfer to Millwall, but he was born in Teeling, I think I'm right in pronouncing that, in Angus, which is nestled in the foot of the Sidlow Hills, which is just north of Dundee, which was a fertile recruitment ground for us for an awful while.
Well, I was just going to say, we took a lot of players from the that part of Scotland, didn't we? I mean, this would be via, I guess, the great name of Bob Hunter, who was himself a Scot, and he had an ability to find and unearth talented players from his home turf. And I'm guessing that George would be one such player that came to us via Bob Hunter, I imagine. I can't think who else would have found him.
Quite possibly, but we also had scouts up there, and there was a strong Millwall connection.
Right.
With players from up there. So, but this guy, he actually started off, he wasn't actually signed from a Scottish club. So it's quite possible that we heard about him when he...
Okay, right.
Yeah, when he either played for Sunderland, he played for Sunderland Albion, which is a forerunner of what we now know as Sunderland AF.
Right. Okay.
Then played for Burnley in the First Division, joined them in May 1892.
Sunderland Albion in 1890, and he's gone to First Division Burnley in the Football League, May 1892. That was a major move for him. I mean, the Football League was increasingly becoming a powerhouse, wasn't it? It was becoming the dominant league in these years. So that was quite a move, into the big time for him.
Yeah, and then when Millwall we turned professional in December 1893. And the Southern League was formed, and Fred Kidd, who was our manager back then, obviously before then we were just local players and amateurs, and so we had to up our game slightly. So off he set to build a side capable of playing against the best teams in the south, and there were some very strong teams in the south. Obviously, we played Woolwich, Arsenal, I think Tottenham were in the Southern League and teams like that. And so he brought in 7 Scottish players. Obviously, Scotland, but a lot of Scottish players were professional.
Yeah,
they were seen as being the best. Were the best players back then. So in came George King, a right half, and signed for Millwall in June 1894. But that's when it starts to get interesting in true Millwall.
Well, it's true Millwall fashion. It's a messy transfer, isn't it? So I'm just reading from Neil's notes here, listeners. George King signed for us in June 1894. Burnley apparently had told him he wasn't a part of their plans, and he was given a week's notice, and then Mill signed him on. But apparently, because he'd signed with Burnley for the 1894-5 season before a change of rules, it meant that Burnley still held his registration and were allowed to seek a fee for him. Now, seeking a fee from Mill would have been something he probably didn't want to pay, and I imagine that's going to be part of the problem.
Yeah, but that's something of a shock back then, because obviously, you were giving your contract in July.
Yeah.
And it ran through to May, and the club decided that they either wanted to keep you but sell you, or release you. But I think there was a change of rules that summer which brought that system in. But because he joined Burnley the season before that, it actually signed a 2-year contract.
Right.
So even though they didn't want him and they gave him a week's notice, they still held his registration.
Clubs used to wield great power back then. I mean, the rights and abilities of players to move were not on the modern scale, where a contract ends and they move on. But they still had quite a bit of sway over players, didn't they? At this point,
it was slavery in effect. He told, but it was the old master and servant, wasn't it? You had the boardroom and told you what to do, and you jolly well had to get on with it.
You go do it. We were put in a bit of a pickle though, because Burnley still held his registration. So to cut a long story short, but if we tried to register him, despite him signing with us, the FA would then would require us to explain why we've approached a player who was still registered with a league club, which could have meant, as Neil said earlier on in this show, a boycott. The clubs would have refused to have played us from league clubs, and we couldn't arrange friendly games. We'd have been outcast from the game. Not for the last time.
Certainly,
but that could have happened.
It was just friendlies, as we've said on previous shows, were very lucrative, especially against football league clubs.
Yeah.
Because you had to pay the wages, and they were semi-well paid. Yeah, but I doubt however many shillings or whatever it cost to go into a ground covered the wage bill, and you wouldn't have had corporate hospitality and refreshments, I guess. So they actually arranged midweek friendlies because the Southern League wasn't played.
So this would have been quite a sanction on us if it had come to that. The FA called an emergency committee to decide the matter, which allowed King to play for Millwall, and he made his debut in 1894. I see. A 9-0 victory, 9-0 against Swindon Town, 6-0 up at half time. You don't get games like that anymore, Neil, do you?
Yeah, you'd still have people complaining, that we hadn't scored 10 and we're taking our foot off the gas in the second half. I think Jimmy Wilson scored 4 goals that day. Scottish won the end.
September. I mean, I think the FA have slightly thrown their hands up and said a plague on both your houses. In the October, Millwall was censured by the FA, and Burnley were ordered to transfer George King properly. So I think there's a slight sense of slaps on the knees for both clubs there, really, and maybe a sense of time being taken on a matter that should have been sorted out privately, perhaps.
Yeah, but a little bit later, of course, if a club held onto your registration, players actually did move into the Southern League
Yeah,
as a way to get around the regulations.
different league, I suppose. Yeah, yeah.
And you weren't, but George King was quite a prominent player in the early Millwall history. Won the Southern League twice, and he won the Western League twice in his 4 seasons on the East Ferry Road. Represented the Southern League,
Yeah.
and but departed the Dockers, as we were known back then, with Willie Jones to play for Ryde on the Isle of Wight. Only at Millwall could have Millwall lose a player to Ryde on the Isle of Wight.
Where he worked as a general labourer. I think only at Millwall do you move out of a successful football career and finish up on the Isle of Wight as a labourer. There we are, George. He returned to Sunderland, I see here, becoming a carpenter's labourer for the River Wear Commissioners. As with so many men of his era, though, Neil, the First World War offered a kind of a route out of hard labour in a sense, although there was a hard route that you were taking. He joined the 20th Tyneside Scottish Regiment of Northumberland Fusiliers at the outbreak of war. Just looking at his age, I mean, war is a young man's pursuit, if that's the right way to put it. But he was of an age. I mean, he was born in 1869, so that would have made him he's 46 when he would pass away. That's old for battle fighting.
Nowadays I don't think it would be allowed to happen, would it? Unless you'd get through all of the young men first, and then you'd move on.
Unless you're in desperation days. I mean, I know obviously at the conclusion of the Second World War, the Nazi Germany were reduced to signing youngsters and the elderly because they'd used up the mid-range age groups. But to be in the Battle of the Somme at the age of 46 would have been hard. Obviously, the Battle of the Somme in itself, listeners, those that hopefully everyone would have heard of it, but you never know, was one of the most horrendous battles of the First World War from the British and Commonwealth perspective. 57,470 killed, wounded, or captured. I think the first day of the Somme, Neil, was the biggest single loss of life in one occasion. I had an idea there was 19,000 killed on the opening day, or there was some huge number. I don't have to check the numbers, but it was a massive loss. Made all the more poignant because this was the first of the conscript armies battles. The opening phase of the First World War consisted largely of volunteer soldiers, and that had been used up largely in the early battles. And there was a need and a controversy, for that matter, as to whether the country should conscript young men into the army, and the decision was taken they would do. But of course, you can't go from civilian life to being able to fight and win a battle without training. So there was a long period of conscription and then training. I think it was called Kitchener's Army, which was the one that took the field on the 1st of July 1916. Sadly, the tactics weren't up to the realities of trench warfare, and many died in the opening hours of that battle, including George King. And I mean, as we've said this a few times, Neil, I think part of the reason that we both want to do these shows is to give a voice and remember names that otherwise would be lost. Because I will genuinely admit, listeners, I didn't know George's name until I saw it pop up on Twitter, and I didn't know that he had a Millwall connection. And it's a bit of an honour to be able to do it, really, Neil, to be able to mention his name and to remember the lives and the sacrifices these men made.
Yeah, they're brave. Yeah, they're brave beyond words, aren't they?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
I remember them every year, don't we? But when you get tagged into it and then you start, I was aware of George King,
right,
through the controversy of his transfer move. But at the age of 46, you'd almost be thinking about putting your feet up.
Well, you would do. I mean, especially back then. I mean, another harsh reality is that life expectancy for the average working class man then was a lot less than what it would be now. In fact, one of the strange ironies of military life was that many of the guys that joined up were actually better fed, better clothed, and better housed in the army than they were in their regular lives back in the industrial towns and cities of home. So I think that's one of the reasons why many did join. Having done a little bit of family history on my account, you can see this process where men of all of our families, every single person listening to this show, I guarantee, will find people in their family that have joined up for those reasons. That it was, as much patriotism as it was a desire for regular money and food and lodging and clothing. And this was the driving force behind many people's decisions to join up. And obviously it's a personal thing in the end, but that's what drove many people.
Yeah, there was also a sense of shame if you didn't do it. You were
yeah.
You were actually expected to do your duty, weren't you? And you're almost shunned, outcast, wouldn't you?
Yeah. It's a strange thing. I think you're right. The social pressure. I mean, they recruited at football grounds. There's a famous poster that I think we've all seen at various points. The famous one, "Men of Millwall, the enemies." I can't remember how they put it now. The enemy was at the gates. Join up. Something of that kind. It was very much
duty, wasn't it, or something?
Something of those lines. Yeah. And I think there was a sense that you didn't want to be the one that let the side down in some ways. That team mentality, I suppose they played on that. And it's both uplifting and tragic all in one go, I suppose. And the Battle of the Somme is probably the very epitome of the First World War. If you ask most people what the First World War looked like, you would say something like the Battle of the Somme. Interestingly, for anyone that does look into the battles of the First War, eventually tactics would evolve, and eventually I think there's a famous phrase that our troops were lions led by donkeys. Eventually, enough lessons were learned for it to become one of the most efficient fighting forces, I think, certainly in that conflict and since, because the battles at the end of the war were decisive. The Germans were roundly defeated in the end on the field of battle, and you don't do that unless you've learned some pretty hard lessons. And the likes of George King and many others were unfortunately the price that had to be paid, some might say. Easy for if you're not the person paying the price, I suppose, to say that. But there we are. George King, I think it's worth remembering his name. 1869 to 1916, died, place of death, the Somme in France. R.I.P. George King. Big thank you to Neil Fissler for joining for this slightly somber show, but I think you have to remember these names. There's a picture of George I found online. I'll put that out with this particular edition. Big thank you, Neil Fissler, for joining me on this show, mate.
No problem at all, Nick. Speak to everybody again in a few days.
It's Nick and Neil's Summer Millwall History Show.